Well, I consider myself extremely fortunate to be with retired Admiral Arnè Söderlund today, who I only met last week, but what a fascinating time I had with you, sir. Thanks very much for some of your time today.
Thanks, Hannes. It's a pleasure.
Arnè is the co-author with Dostane of this absolutely fascinating book, Iron Fist from the Sea, which covers, I think, all the South African maritime operations that were conducted during the course of hostilities. And it was a huge eye-opener for me to get a better understanding of what actually went on. But Arnè, apart from being a retired naval officer, is also a historian and the proprietor of the most amazing private museum, I think, in the country. 400 collections, over 9 display galleries, an incredible walk down through memory lane for me the other day, a place I could easily spend days in. And Arnè uses it to raise money for his Sunflower Fund to help people who need assistance in cancer treatments. But what a fascinating afternoon that was. We're talking about fighting Men of Rhodesia, and so Arnè is very much a South African, but I wanted him to come in and tell us more about the background to the maritime operations that the South African Navy was involved in conjunction with the Rhodesian SAS in the last 2 years of the Rhodesian War. A truly fascinating time, and Arnè knows a lot about that. But Arnè, just before we get into that, and now that I know a bit more about you, I know we haven't got time to go through it in detail, but just a brief summary of your life, where you were born, and up into just your naval career, and then we can go back to talking about the Rhodesian experience.
Certainly, Hannes. I grew up in Kimberley, which is part of the history of Rhodesia as well. And in fact, my great-grandfather was Cecil John Rhodes' election secretary and the curator of Kenilworth Village, which he built for Cecil John Rhodes. So I've got a lot of links to Rhodesia. I had a number of cousins living up there. So I did actually visit there many years ago in the early 60s. I went to CBC Kimberley, and I was in the Sea Scouts, and as a result of that, I just tended to go towards the Navy. And I joined the Navy on completion of at the age of 17 and a half, in fact. And why 17 and a half is important, when I joined, they told me I could either become a chef or a steward, as I was under 18. And when they said, you've got to wait till 18, I said, is there any other one? They said, yes, you can apply to become an officer. So I did, and I got selected. So that's the start of my career. 1966, in February, I started my training.
And then, Arnè, you spent time in South America?
Yes, I went across as a young midshipman. I was selected to go around, join the Argentinian Navy for about 8 months. And I sailed in a square rigger, the largest square rig ship in the world, out of Libertad. And we did South America, Central America, North America, across to Europe, down Africa, and back, including Sierra Leone, where I got arrested.
Yeah, do you want to just tell us a little bit about what happened there in Sierra Leone?
I took a picture of the guard outside the Governor General, the President's palace, and the next thing, a civilian started shouting, and a policeman came out and asked me where I had permission to take pictures. I explained to him he didn't need it. He didn't agree, so he took me in and put me into a cell. Luckily, I'd watched the changing of the guard, and he then went off, and the sergeant in charge of the guard happened to come past. I called him across and said, I did ask permission from one of your soldiers. This is about an hour later, and I was still waiting for the people to arrive. And he brought a soldier to me and said, was this the man? I just said, yes. I mean, would it be funny, but in uniform, they all looked alike. The soldier then agreed. He clapped him and then told me, yeah, gave me my shoelaces, my camera back. I had to take the film out, my belt, and tell me to run like hell. So I went back to the ship and didn't go ashore again.
Oh, no,
that was in 1969. So not a good time to be in Sierra Leone prison.
No. You also spent time in the Chilean Navy.
Yes, I went to Chile a few times. In 1980, I went across there for 6 weeks, which I seconded because I spoke Spanish from Libertad. And I spent time in most of their ships, and I pride myself on having served on 4 cruises in my career, 3 at sea, all in the Chilean Navy. And I've been back there a few times on other visits. I went back as the flag captain as well. So I've had a good experience with the Chilean Navy, one of the most professional navies in the world.
Interesting. And Arnè, time with the Israelis, and just tell us a bit about the background to the Strikecraft story, the acquisition, and your time with the Israelis.
Right. In 1975, we signed a contract, our Minister of Defense did, in fact, to acquire 3 Strikecraft from the Israelis, plus another 3 to be manufactured in South Africa. We were sent across in small batches. It was a secret operation, initially top secret, but that would have been possible. And we went there undercover. And in my case, I lived there for just under 3 years, where we first of all did a language course. This was only the main component. The officers and the senior rates were very critical. We then did a course on missiles and gunnery, whereafter I went and spent 6 months in Sharm el-Sheikh, working with the Israeli Navy, doing operations with them. Then we went back and we stood by the building of our ships. We drew up all the documentation. And then one night, in our case, on the 6th of December, I went to work in the morning, told my wife, "See you tonight, love." And that night we slipped out and came home. It was a very quick trip home, 18 days, but we didn't stop off anywhere. We got refueled at sea by Tafelberg. And we had to do this because it was a secret thing and we could not risk being seen or caught or known. The project was still secret. And the 3 ships came back. So that's how we started.
Just tell us a bit about the Strikecraft. It's an Israeli design, but it was modified for the South African Navy.
Not really. It's originally a German design, the original SAR class, built in France, and then they had to steal 3 of their ships, or 6 of their ships out of France. And they discovered they were a bit small, so they lengthened the design, and it became the Reshev. And 4 of them came past South Africa. We saw them here. The minister saw them as well. And that's how we got to acquire them. They were unmodified, basically. We did certain modifications later, especially for special forces. But it was the lengthened original SAR, German design, French make, and then Israeli built. So it's got quite a long pedigree.
And your time with the Israelis, Arnè, was that an enjoyable, enlightening time?
That was thoroughly enlightening and very, very important. We learned a lot from being a Royal Navy orientated vessel or Navy with strict manners and all sorts of things like that. We learned to become operational. And it stood us in good stead for the war ahead. It was similar to the submarines, where they also learned the real way of running things. And it made us an extremely professional Navy at that time.
And their system was a little less reliant on discipline, was it?
It's a lot easier. They do have discipline, but not quite the same. I think their strong morale and motivation, and in fact the threat to them holds them together, makes them coherent. But they don't have all the wonderful uniforms and dresses of the day and ceremonial. They're a lot simpler, but a lot more ready to do things. We, in fact, became very much like them. A lot of people didn't like it here, but it was for a reason. At sea on a Strikecraft, you always wore a life belt, which was a very safe thing. You wore a lifeline if you had to go on the upper deck. You weren't allowed in the upper deck. So it was strict, but for good reasons.
And Arnè, just tell us a bit about the submarines, the Daphne class submarines, how they came to be in the South African Navy, and just a bit about the acquisition.
Okay, that was another big acquisition in the in the late 1960s. We decided we needed submarines because not only as a deterrent, but at that stage, even to exercise our anti-submarine abilities, we used to have to rely on Royal Navy submarines. And we then set out a project to acquire submarines. We initially looked at the British submarines because we were used to them, very good submarines. But at the time, it was the Oberon class. The government in England was not, the UK was not going to give it to us, so we had to look elsewhere. And we chanced across the Daphne, which turned out to be one of the most perfect purchases we ever made. They're small, they're safe, they're lovely little submarines. And it was a similar project where we sent everyone across to France. When I say everybody, that was a lot more open then, it's an open contract, where they went to sea with the French Navy. They did their courses there. They actually did their courses in French. We still had English courses at least, but our language courses were very good for working on the ships. And they came back as an operational boat as well. In fact, I'm very proud to say that the 3 captains that brought our boats back were all highly assessed by the French Navy and said they were as good as anything they had. So the Daphnes were very professional, and we kept that tradition going.
Arnè, one of the first, if I'm correct, one of the first South African Navy covert operations, combat operational operations, was up to Tanzania in the early 70s. Would you mind just talking a little bit about that and what went on there?
That was quite a remarkable achievement as well. Just the first thing to mention is the submarine that took part in it had been back in South Africa for 6 months when to show how operational they were. At the time, we were assisting the Portuguese in Mozambique, and with the Frelimo threat from the north, they were looking at all sorts of solutions, and they came across the fact that the President Nyerere was supporting them very actively, getting them across the border, and they found a dissident who used to be a friend of Nyerere, but was now in exile, and they decided to try and give him some credibility to get him to take over as the president. Sounds like a fairy tale, but that's what it worked out to be. So we decided to interfere locally and give him a bit of credibility as a formidable force. And the original Special Forces group, consisting of Breitenbach and 5 companions, were trained up. 2 were Navy warrant officers. Ken Bruin was one of them at the time, who ended up in Special Forces as well. They were trained up in kayaks, and the submarine took them up the coast, landed them off of Dar es Salaam. They went ashore not to do any major damage, but to attract attention. They blew up the bridge just to the north of, or tried to blow up part of the bridge to the north of Dar es Salaam, which connected with a residential area. They then knocked out a few pylons, and while wandering around, saw a Rolls Royce standing outside, so they placed a bomb under it as well. It turned out that was the British High Commissioner's car, by the way. They came back, and out of that, a lot of them, in fact, the highest decoration you could get for bravery at the time in action, the Van Riebeeck decoration, went to Woody Woodburn, the captain of the submarine, and Breitenbach, and then the others got the Van Riebeeck medal. So it was not a great success in terms of damage done, and didn't have any impression on the war itself, but it showed what could be done. It was the sign of things to come.
Arnè, you mentioned Woodburn, and it's the stuff of legend, but the story about him breaking through an American cordon and putting himself in position to sink an aircraft carrier can you take us through that particular story?
Afraid not, it never happened.
Where does that come from?
That's actually a Strikecraft story. Funny enough, I was approached the other day by someone with a similar one. I think it was the Carl Vincent and 2 aircraft carriers was coming around the Cape in about 1979. And because it was a nuclear force, they were at high speed. And we normally escort ships around the Cape if we see them, foreign ships, just to show that we are here. And they sent 2 strike craft from Durban. The 2 strike craft had a very strong following sea, and they went absolutely quiet, no radar. But the Americans, of course, being larger vessels, was transmitting on their normal navigation radar. So our chaps, being 2 of them together and going with the seas, could pick them up, pinpoint them. And when they got within what we called missile range, which is 18 miles, our 2 strike craft suddenly popped up, switched on their radars, and came alongside this force. It was a bit of a smack in the eye because it was the closest I think they'd ever expect anyone to get them that close. And during the incident, one of the ships turning, when you turn with the sea, you don't turn very fast because it tends to straighten you out again. And the one ship came quite close to one of the American vessels, which caused consternation. But by our close, it's up to 50 yards, 60 yards is very, very close. The Americans, became a diplomatic incident. But Woody Woodburn was superb. And in fact, in France, in the Mediterranean, where there's very good detection, he was able, on one of his exercises, to sink the main body and the escorting force in the Mediterranean, all French Navy. And the French Navy at the moment are very, very good with their anti-submarine capability. They've just won the prize, the American prize for the best anti-submarine hunters that they operate with. So that was a smack in the eye for them, not smack in the eye, showed how good they were.
Amazing story. Arnè, just onto now the involvement with the Rhodesians on operations in Mozambique. I just maybe just a little bit of a political background, because this must have been a very high-level decision to allow use of South African assets like submarines and strikecraft in operations of this nature, bearing in mind the potential for political embarrassment. Who would have made that decision to allow these assets to be used?
One of the rules here is that to any engagement or operation outside of our waters has to be approved by the highest authority. This would have had to come from cabinet level at least. It would have had to. But it was a package deal initially. As you know, with the downing of the Viscount, the decision was taken that was it. And Operation Bastille, I think you called it, was to take out Nkomo. But the problem was that Robert Mugabe was unfortunately living in Maputo at the time. And the only way to get in would have been from the sea. And that's why Ops came up with an operation called Milk Float, which was a basket of little operations which they got approved from through the South African cabinet. And the special forces here were tasked to assist them. In fact, the whole idea was special forces would put them ashore. They would do everything, but we would put them ashore. So we were not actively taking part in it, we were in a supporting role. But it was critical because in the end, it was the first strikecraft operation ever.
Okay, can you just talk us through the planning and the actual the operations? I know there were several attempts on Mugabe in Maputo, and just what went on.
Okay, the original one was in fact Operation Lark, which was part of Milk Float, and that was the landing by a submarine of a team of SAS in Maputo to take him out. The teams were going to be landed from a submarine, as we said, because we had that proven ability. But when they came down to exercise at Langebaan, they discovered that the small rubber boats which fitted on submarines, the Mark II Zodiacs, just couldn't take the people concerned. So the answer was quite simple, and being recce's, they went one bigger in size, and they got the Mark V, which could take double the capacity. Instead of a 40 horsepower little motor, it had 250 horsepower. It was an inflatable boat. The idea was great. However, when it came to fitting it in the submarine, it was a no-go. Couldn't get the engines inside the submarine. You don't have roof racks in submarines. Things get very wet. So they sat with a, as we say, a panari. At that stage, I had designed a ramp, and we'd exercised with 4 recce before they became 4 recce down Durban. And I'd made a ramp which fitted for putting boats up and down. So they said, that is the answer. They then got permission to use a submarine and a strikecraft to carry the boats. They came down here under great secrecy, but they discovered to their horror there was only 1 ramp. They had to get 2 of these big boats into the water within a certain time, because you had to have time to run in, time to run out, etc. And they discovered that you could only assemble 1 boat at a time, and it would take double the time to launch them. So I happened to be, because the ship was the P1562, the second of the Strikecraft, the one I'd brought back. And I'd been the person who'd done all the seamanship work in Israel and designed the South African seamanship work. So I was asked to go down and see if we couldn't make it work. And between 2 of us, we developed a new ramp, a very temporary ramp. And I worked out the drill. And before that, I was asked if I'd go along as well and be the seamanship officer to the landing. So the night in question in November 1970, oh, it was 78 still. Yeah, November 78. Yeah. We waited for the arrival of the Zebra team under Major Graham Wilson, and they arrived. I must just add that before this operation, before we became involved, Graham Wilson and Peter Sutcliffe, who was a lieutenant in the 4 recce, the intelligence officer, had done a preliminary recce of Maputo. They knew where Mugabe stayed, Rua Maria Secunda, Villa Maria Secunda, but they wanted to check the routes. So they had a very clever cover story. The 2 of them posed as work-study officers and were put on board the Jan Hugo, which was a collier, which is to do nothing but run coal up and down the coast. And they were told they would act as work-study officers, which made the crew officers on board very nervous, because they'd been doing this for years and didn't need to be told how to do anything. But the advantage was that while they were loading coal, these 2 had nothing to do, so they wandered around, tourists almost, with their papers, and they were able to recce the route completely. Anyway, when the operation started, just before we departed on the boat with all the teams, Graham and 1 other were picked up by the submarine, and they went and did a last-minute recce ashore. The Strikecraft met up with the submarine at sea. We had the boats on board and the men. They transferred Graham, the 1 operator, to us. And that night, we closed Maputo. And at about 1900 in the evening, we started assembling the boats. We launched them. And the plan was that they would go in, land the men, bring them out, and they'd be recovered by the submarine. What would happen is the boats would be destroyed, sunk, and the submarine would go out to make sure that there was no visual evidence. As you said, it would be very embarrassing if we were involved, so we had to be clear of the coast. So the moment we dropped the boats, the 2 boats with all their teams and their weapons and everything, we went out to sea and, in fact, headed home. However, in the early hours of the morning, I got awoken and told, stand by to recover. We turned around and rushed back. And we met up with the submarine, because what had happened was that 1 of the boats in the rough weather had the weights on board, the bottom boards had come loose. And she could not go at any speed at that stage, which meant the whole operation had to be aborted. When they sent the submarine to pick them up, they decided they could not just sink the boats. There were a number of reasons. One reason being that it's in fairly shallow water, and any aircraft over would have seen the wreckage below in the clear water. But I think the other reason was for the chap in charge of the boats. We hadn't used them properly, so we tried to recover them. And they very cleverly pulled him up onto the submarine, and she came out, because it was early. She came out on the surface, and we recovered the boats from her. And that was the end of Lark. But we realized the mistakes, and we went and looked at this. At that stage, I had nothing more to do with it. But when I wrote the book, I subsequently discovered, though I did know something was happening at the time, that they decided to try again at Christmas. And in fact, it was called Lark 2. Now, at that stage, our Strikecraft were not secret, but confidential. We could never have two in the same port at once. So we had one at sea, one in Durban, one in Cape Town. And because when it came time for Lark 2, the ship that did Lark 1, which was boat 2, was now in Cape Town. So they decided not mess around, and we used the first boat, boat 1. But they went and exercised first, so it was all done very well. And a similar operation was going to be done. The submarine, unfortunately, did break down, had a problem in East London, so it was late, and everything was delayed until Christmas. But once again at Christmas, this time the boat went in, she launched. The bottom boards were okay on this particular operation, though I know that later they had another case of that. The teams got ashore, they got up to the house, and when they got to Mugabe's house, it was covered in darkness, and there was nobody there. They hung around a bit, nothing could be done, and they realized that if he had gone out, if he was due to come back, there'd at least be a servant there and a light ready to receive him back. So they realized something was funny. Now, bearing in mind that they had agents ashore there who signaled to us that he was home at 6 o'clock that evening, something was suspicious. So, however, the teams withdrew and they discovered they'd have to try it again. Comes Operation Bargain, which was in January 1979, a lot later now, time was moving on. They decided to have another go. And once again, boat 2 was around, the same captain, so it was very easy to organize. But this time they decided they're going to take an extra boat because of the problems with speed, etc. So they decided not to use a submarine. So this was a purely Strikecraft one. We decided to take it out of the equation by having a third boat. The boats could go faster, and we moved the landing in a bit closer, or the launching in a bit closer. Bargain was almost a rerun of the Lark 2 in that they got ashore, they went up to the house, and once again, nobody there. They realized at that stage, they were challenged, in fact, by a night watchman from one of the other houses, so that there would have been, it was life around, but not at Mugabe's house. And once again, they had to withdraw. There was nothing else they could do about it. This time, they stayed a bit longer, and by the time the boats were coming back, it was getting a bit close for the Strikecraft. She could not stay around because it might be picked up by aircraft. There were 3 boats this time, but what happened was the Strikecraft closed them, took all the passengers, and then sped out to sea and told the 3 boats to follow. The whole idea being once she's clear of the land, they can recover the boats in their own time. And the boats went at speed, but now they were light. And sadly, one of the boats, once again, dislodged a floorboard. And the boat eventually became a dead weight. So they decided to sink her and go back with the other 2. What was quite interesting was that the chap in charge, when he plunged his knife into the thing, nearly got flung overboard by the escaping air. But anyway, they eventually got back and got recovered. So it cost us a boat. But at that stage, we realized that what we really needed was solid boats. The inflatable boats were very good, not for operations, carrying people with heavy equipment. And so that was a very big lesson, a very important one. The final operation under Milk Float was actually a more intriguing one. It was dairy. And that was carried out in March 1979. And at that stage, the fuel situation, Rhodesia was getting fuel from us, but fuel for the terrorists and the Frelimo, which supporting them, was all landed and kept in Beira. The decision was made to try and take out fuels. That was quite an important one. So this time we would have to have 2 Strikecraft. The 2 Strikecraft were 64 and 63. Those 4 were the only ones who took part in the original operations. And they embarked 20 SAS members. And this time it is under Bob McKenzie, I think he was a major at the time. And they were taken up to Beira, where they were landed. They went ashore just north of the harbor, sorry, just south of the harbor. And it was an interesting plan too, because of the experience of the Salisbury attack. They decided that the best way of taking out the fuel farm there was in fact using RPG-7s and tracer armor-piercing ammunition from afar. Very much safer as well. I know they did a recce and a Canberra, and so they knew the entire situation very well. The interesting part was that there were other subsidiary targets. One was a big power pylon giving power to the area, and the other was the pipeline itself. And I know Mike Rich and Colin Willis were the two who were going to do those two. Anyway, it took a bit of time to get to position, and they're running out of time, so they did do the pipeline. I'm not sure about the other, but as soon as Colin Willis was back and he joined the main team, they signaled the start of it. I think it was Bob fired an RPG-7 into a tank in front of him. And this started a little mini war because from two sides, the SAS blasted the tanks in this place. The interesting thing was that they had a 37mm AA battery, and they immediately thought they were under air attack. So they helped the confusion by firing into the night sky, firing across. And in fact, at one stage, even fired over the heads of the SAS. But because they were high-angle guns, they couldn't hit anything. At which stage, the SAS withdrew and were picked up and taken back to sea. That was a very successful operation. They took out a lot of tanks. And what they didn't take out in burning, they took out in seepage, holding the tanks. It was very interesting that the team that eventually put out the fires and went there salvage was the same team from South Africa that did the Salisbury attack. So they could assess the damage very well as well. But that was the end of the Milk Float series of operations. But the two governments were getting on very well, and I think they realized that South Africa didn't want Robert Mugabe there, so they were quite happy to do a few more exercises. And the next exercise was one of the most interesting ones for me, was Operation Boxer. By the way, you can stop me at any stage, please, just if you've got any queries.
Yeah.
Operation Boxer was in September 1979, and that was a very interesting attack. It was the first time South African forces would actually be involved in the operation. And the idea was to close Beira for the delivery to heavy vessels. And they were going to do that by sinking the dredges and stopping them being repaired, because the Pungwe River comes down, brings a lot of silt down. It silts up the harbor very quick. And this was September before the rainy season. So that was one of the primary objectives. But the other main objective was to take out the entire communications network in the Beira area. It was in a building, on the first floor of a building in the town. And the two ships were 61 and 62, the senior ship being 61. As luck would have it, but I had now qualified to take command of a Strikecraft. But one of the things you had to do before getting your own command was to accompany a ship on an operation and sit with a captain, to go through the operation with a captain. So this was my chance to learn. I was on board 62. 62 carried two boats, one for a team of 5 SAS, and their target was going to be a warehouse in the harbor itself. And this is the warehouse where the Zanla forces kept all their landed equipment and weapons. The second boat would carry a team of 4 recce divers, 3 divers and a supervisor. And their target would be to blow up the dry dock entrance and then sink the dredges. The main assault team from the SAS was 10 members, and they were carried on boat 1. And they were under Colin Willis. And there were 10 of them. And their targets were the communications building, but they had a secondary target as well. The secondary target was the local prison. The idea being to release Renamo prisoners there by breaking them out and to add to the cover story that it was a Renamo attack. So it was a very interesting operation. The 2 Strikecraft sailed from Durban to go north. It was further than normal. LM was a day trip. And we sailed with 2 days to get there. But on leaving Durban at night, everything was done at night and the people brought on board at night. We hit very rough weather. And in fact, it was really, really rough. They flooded our wheelhouse and they smashed our director, the heavy seas going over, and we were down to crawling along. On the night, the captain of boat 2 said he was not feeling well. And by morning, he was very sick. And in fact, we had to get a doctor to come. And we had to, in fact, get one of the reccees who wasn't seasick to bring the doctor because he had to help him there. The doctor discovered that our captain had measles. Now, to me, measles was a childhood sickness, but apparently it was a bad sickness in this particular case. He quickly had to evaluate, and because the doctor said that bed rest was about all he could do, we didn't have to go back. So the decision was taken by Woody Woodburn that we will continue the operation. And because I was there, qualified, I would act in command. I must just mention that normally under such circumstances, the 2IC of the ship takes command. But because the 2IC was not command qualified and because the captain was still on board, we agreed between the two of us that I would act as captain. He was very happy for that because he'd only just got there. The big thing was the operation, which was to take place on a Sunday night, was now put out by 1 day. At the time, I'll be blunt, I didn't even realize that. I didn't think about that either. I wasn't part of the initial planning. And we went ahead with it, and that we now went in on a Monday. The 2 Strikecraft crept up, approached the harbor, the Makuti Channel, where we're going to go up the Makuti Channel. We picked up 2 ships or 2 contacts on our radar. Because they had no ability to pick up our radar, we operated on radar. We put on this fishing disguise lights to make us look like fishing boats, and we closed in. However, all of a sudden, we discovered the one ship was actually a pilot boat. And how they picked us up, well, obviously our fishing lights, and they started flashing us Alpha, 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 which means what ship? And we didn't feel that we really should tell them. So what happened was we just ignored them, and I turned to the right and I went and hid behind the big ship. And the flashing stopped. Anyway, we then landed I switched my lights off, not attract attention, and we now launched the boats, and they went in. The 10 SAS members were landed in the mud, very muddy area, and they headed towards the town. The other 2 boats hung around for a bit until they had the order to go, because we didn't want, it had to be coordinated, because there was going to be explosions and everything. Unfortunately, it turned out that they got to the town too early, and instead of being there at 2300, they were there by 2200, and they were walking. They changed into Frelimo uniforms the moment they got ashore, and they walked as a patrol. They walked up to identify the building and discovered that not only wasn't there just one man guarding it, but there was a guard outside it. They were going to use the back gate to get in, and they discovered there was a bus stop there and lots of people waiting for buses, cinemas. So they walked up a side road and into a construction site to observe. Unfortunately, the watchman saw them and he wondered about them. He wasn't going to go after them. He went to the guards at the communication center and he asked them what is going on. So the guards then found a Frelimo patrol. I realized something's funny because there's another patrol there. And this patrol marched up to go and investigate. Colin and, actually that was Mike Rich on this one, were armed with American 180s, silenced machine guns, and they went forward and then opened up on this patrol. I think they didn't realize that without the sound, the rest of the patrol didn't even realize they were being fired at until the two targets were shot dead, and then they had to run for it. And they had to run all the way back. They were followed. So that, first of all, the prison wasn't touched. But at the same time, the team in the dockyard, the harbor, the 5 men down there had to wait because they were only supposed to do their attack after they got the confirmation that the other team was in. So they had to withdraw. However, at the same time, the divers had already started mining, looking to mine the dock gates. It turned out to be a bit of a chaos because the dock gates were hinged at the bottom at 9 meters deep, and they had oxygen sets, which meant they couldn't dive. It's pure oxygen. They couldn't dive further than a certain amount. They eventually got down to it, scraped through the mud to find the hinges. In the darkness, they broke the pin on one of the mines. So being clever recce's and SAS people are there because they're clever, they put another mine on top of this mine on the one hinge, and they activated it. As they swam away, got around the corner, it exploded. This was quite a shock. They both had to surface because they were disorientated now. And luckily, they were seen by the boat with the other 4, the SAS in, and quickly taken back to their boat. And they then went on, in spite of the fact that the whole operation was now being called off because of the being caught, being seen. They went on and mined 2 Pungwe and the Matola, the 2 dredgers, which was quite a thing to do. Having just had a premature detonation, they took a risk and they did it. So all the forces then withdrew and we cleared out home. In the end, the operation in a way was a success in that the harbor was soon restricting shipping. The Pungwe and the Matola was eventually salvaged, but it took a long time. South African team did it, South African Diving Services, which enabled us to evaluate the damage, another very good thing. And it took a long time before they resumed. So that was that dairy. From one side, an interesting operation, but from the other side, not very happy because we didn't achieve very much ashore. But that wasn't the end though, because back as the house, etc., and with the date approaching, it was obviously that South Africa was still very keen not to have Mugabe there. And they agreed to the final operation with the Zimbabwe Rhodesian forces, which was called Operation Trample. Now, this was a rerun of the Mugabe exercise. Based on the previous experience, once again, it was one ship, but this time they had to take 3 boats again. Oh, sorry, they took 2 boats because of the delay. The Strikecraft selected was boat 5. Interesting enough, the captain of boat 5 was the captain of the dairy. He'd now moved to another ship. And they went in once again with the Zebra team, the group under Graham Wilson. And I'm trying to think, they went into in June 1980. This time they decided they were going to try and get, they had the same problem again, that they're out of time. So they decided they needed another boat, and they asked for another Strikecraft. One of the Strikecraft, boat 4, which had been with her in dairy, happened to be working up in Richards Bay. She had nothing on her, but she was quickly told, wait there. They rushed in 2 boats, flew in 2 boats and the operators from Langebaan. They put ramps on board, and she sailed out to meet up and to transfer a boat because one of the boats on the other ship had been damaged. So when they got to an area way off of Ponta de Oro, they exchanged the boats. And during this exchange, in fact, one of the boats flipped over. The chaps all swam out and they got most of the stuff back. And one of the amazing stories was that once a boat turns over, its engines are completely submerged as well. But the Strikecraft worked through the night. The next morning, they got the engines going again. But during that night, the other Strikecraft had, the previous night, the other Strikecraft had tried again going down the northern channel, which is going up to the north, coming down the channel into Mozambique. And it discovered the buoys, half the buoys were missing, and she couldn't take the risk of running aground. So now with 2 Strikecraft, 3 boats, and a spare boat, everything was set. And that night, they ran in through the South Channel, which is a very shallow channel. It's very dangerous at night. They have transits, but it's very dangerous, and it was quite hair-raising. Once they got inside, they launched the boats, the 3 boats now, and they went off. The 2 Strikecraft moved slightly south. They were in the bay, and they anchored. And there's some fascinating little stories about this, because they anchored, but they kept the engines running for a while. Then when they had sufficient air to make sure they could start the engines instantly, they switched them off and they had to wait. Now, as is wont in the Navy, as soon as a ship is at anchor, people come and ask to fish. And they came up and asked the captain, who became Chief of the Navy later, Vice Admiral Retief, very brilliant officer. And they went to him and said, "Sir, may we fish?" They said, "You do realize we're in an enemy harbor, and we don't have the right to fish. What will happen if they come and arrest us and detain us for illegal fishing?" The ship's company seemed to accept that one, even though it was rather tongue in the cheek. Meanwhile, as you probably know, most of you people might know, they landed the teams, but they landed them a little bit north of where they should. And they went up to the Marginal, the road, and as they were crossing the Marginal, they suddenly got caught in the headlights of a vehicle. They stopped the vehicle, and while going across to try and convince them to turn away, the 2 chaps tried to escape. They ran, but at the same time, 4 policemen suddenly appeared. And once again, they opened fire with the American 180s. They downed, flattened 3 of the policemen, but the other one escaped into the bushes. So they decided that was it. And it was quite interesting, because by the time they got down to the boats came in very quickly. There were blue lights and sirens going everywhere. It turned out that there was a conference being held there, some African conference, and that somehow that had been missed, because the security had intensified quite considerably. They were then withdrawn. The Strikecraft lifted the anchors. The second Strikecraft, unfortunately, hooked, snagged on a line, etc. And it was almost sunrise. The sun was beginning to, or the light was coming before she cleared this, and they scarpered through that gap at high speed, a lot higher speed than you normally would. Sadly, that was the last. That was the last attempt. There was another attempt apparently, but couldn't have been a naval one. That was to place explosives in the ceiling of the house, etc. But for various reasons, that was cancelled. And that, I'm afraid, was the end of our maritime aspects of SAS operations. 6 operations, some successes, but overall, mainly due to someone in the Comops being a source of information to the British, which allowed them. And it's quite interesting, because in the one case, the morning after they made an attempt, the Zanla and Frelimo security teams were seen going around checking for explosives, etc., which indicated that they did know that there was something planned. So there was a leak known. Quite a few people know about it. It's been published since then.
You're talking about leaks. Arnè, I can remember there was a lot of talk that maybe it was Commander Gerhardt who turned out to be a Russian spy. But I know we talked about this, and you don't believe that he was in possession of that information, and it almost certainly was somebody within the Rhodesian security hierarchy who had that information and leaked it?
The Commodore Gerard was the OC of the dockyard at the time. But all of these operations, there was no link with Simonstown dockyard, other than the fact the submarine departed from there. But I can tell you that even within Strikecraft, nobody knew what was going on, other than the people involved. Security was very intense. And I have little doubt that Gerard would never have heard from any of the sources. There was no link to the dockyard for his authority for anything, his approval of anything. But on top of it, one of the interesting things when we investigated for the book, we actually got hold of the military veterans from Angola. It's a Russian organization, because there were, people don't realize the numbers of, we've seen 5-figure, the number of Russians who served in Angola. The area was thick with Russians. And we went to them, we were in contact with them. It's an old story. We knew veterans from both sides. You love discussing what you did, etc. And we started inquiring if anybody had anything on any of these operations. And as a stroke of luck, one of the members said, yes, he's got a friend called Maxim Ivanov, who took part in one of our operations. And that operation was in I think about 84, 85. And we then discovered through this link, and he gave me information, we then discovered through this group of veterans that until 2005, they had never realized that we'd ever used Strikecraft on operations off their coast. It's an interesting story. They have similar boats, which in fact the Israelis had to counter their Ozas and Komars. But they had the Ozas, which were their bigger missile boats, and they didn't venture more than 400 miles away from any port. And they therefore just assumed that we had the same limitations on our Strikecraft. The fact that we would travel 1,400 miles north and stay out at sea just never crossed their minds. They thought that all these operations were carried out by fishing boats with a flag of ruse, Japanese flag of ruse. Now, on one of those operations, Operation Amazon, the first operation we did on the West Coast, my ship was badly damaged, mainly weather damage, and I got delayed. I had to drop somebody off in Balfour's Bay. But my sister ship also had minor damage, put into Simonstown, got repaired, sailed. I came in afterwards, and Peter Gerard was there on both occasions. He never asked us what we were doing, but he should have seen from the damage that we were doing something high seas or high speeds at sea, etc. Yet they never heard from him, or maybe they didn't disseminate it. But the fact that he had seen us, he could have put two and two together, but he never told them, it appears. I am pretty sure that the Russians were more interested in his NATO knowledge, because he trained in the old days and he had lots of friends in NATO. And the Americans, in fact, arrested him because they were more worried about what he was giving them. So there's been no proof that he ever gave any tactical type information. So I cannot see him having done that. And also, he just wouldn't have had access to it.
Well, just one last question. Your radio traffic, how did you suppress that and avoid compromise? Because surely they had listening posts that would have picked up signals.
We basically, for HF, for example, we listened only. But South Africa is the place that invented the frequency hopping radio. I don't know at that stage whether ever came to Rhodesia, but there were frequency hopping sets which were synced, and they changed frequency all the time, so you could not follow a conversation. And this is the type of crypto we used, and even that we used very, very seldom. We limited it to it. It was because we're very aware of electronic warfare, etc. We were very careful with transmissions. Line of sight, VHF was not as big a problem because it's low wherever their station is, and you're going to have a station to pick it up. If you if it's not within range, you're not going to find much about it. And also, I know a lot of the work that our recce's did was you never spoke, you tapped, you just pushed the transmit key 3 times, a signal 2 times. So there was always that. I do know that the SAS had a special code as well. In fact, I think we discussed that as well. When they retired from the Center of Ira on Operation Dairy, there wasn't Dairy, Boxer, sorry. They put a radio down to help the chap get through the mud, and they left it there. And apparently, from all our reports, the Frelimo thought it was booby-trapped, so they blew it up. But that would have been a breakthrough because they were using codes at that stage. But VHF, which I don't think will be picked up very easily. There's quite a lot of VHF going on. Sorry, I'm not an expert on that.
What would what was your plan if you were compromised and attacked from the air on Strikecraft? Did you have any anti-aircraft capability?
Strangely, we did. We had actually very good. That's an interesting question. On the East Coast, of course, we were never really concerned about that. There was no threat. On the West Coast, one of the rules were that you had to be fully operational to go on to do an operation. And to do that, you had to be 60% clear, TTB cleared. Now, to explain to you, our guns were 76 millimeter, and we decided they were going to be the best option we had. So we spent a lot of effort and money and time, and where they normally had a 20% TTB, the anti-aircraft shell has got a sort of a radio transmitter in it. And if it gets to within a certain range of an aircraft, if you get a target triggered burst, TTB, which means it explodes and it sends shrapnel, and that normally is enough to take an aircraft down. We honed the system in so well on the drives and the guns, by smoothing out, by taking the weather conditions and everything. We made these things that to be operational, you had to have at least 60%, which means out of every 10 rounds that go out, 6 should take out an aircraft. Okay, the range was limited, but we had great faith in them. However, the catch comes that you never want to be too sure. But on the West Coast, on 2 occasions, we knew that there were aircraft looking for us. And it was interesting that the young officers were all very keen, waiting to be able to open fire. Whereas those of us who had children and wanted to live to an older age to have grandchildren, prayed like hell. But the simple solution was very easy. First of all, they could not fly at night in their fighter aircraft. And secondly, they were single engine. Now, if there's one rule that the air forces of the world have, you don't fly over the sea in a single engine. If you do, you go further than gliding distance to the shore. So as soon as we did operations, by the time they were scrambling aircraft, we were 50 miles out at sea, 12 miles was safe. So yes, we did have an ability. If they came too close, we would take them out. But no, we didn't really worry too much because we knew we could just leg it out to sea. I couldn't get you.
Last question, Arnè. What was the closest South African Navy vessel came to a confrontation with an enemy warship?
We didn't. I thought I might at one stage. I unfortunately had to once select a missile, but it turned out to be my fellow ship, which had mistaken the order to wait where he was and had come around to go to where he was supposed to be. But we weren't talking because we didn't talk in those days on radios. But luckily, we discovered when we illuminated him, he illuminated us back. We realized what had happened. But we didn't have any confrontations. On one operation, a Polnocny interrogated my ship, and all I did was I turned away, put on my fishing lights, turned away, and he didn't follow. So we never came close. On 2 operations, we had Russian destroyers in near vicinity. The one was a very interesting one because things went wrong as well. In Namib, we had a Russian destroyer alongside. At the same time, we blew up 2 bridges there. And that was a close call because one of the boats overturned in the surf and one of the other ones caught fire. So the Strikecraft stayed in after they should have been out at sea, picked them up, and then moved it. So we avoided. The big thing was we always avoided identification. They were all covert operations, and we had to deny any possibility of or any chance that we were recognized. We had to make sure we couldn't be recognized. We never flew flags. We were never wearing anything indicative of South Africa. Not that it would have helped much. But.
Fascinating stuff, Arnè. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Terribly interesting, and really appreciate having this on the record.
Hannes, it's a pleasure, and thank you for your book as well. It's always nice to have something recorded.
Thanks, Arnè.
Okay, all the best.
Good seeing you soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.